Hi, this video is about Fulanis. In French they're called Pool, or sometimes they're called Fula, which is a large ethnic group in West Africa. They are at the heart of the jihadist insurgencies that are raging today in much of West Africa. They, I believe, are also the key to resolving these insurgencies. And I'm doing this video because I want to sound the alarm. If there's one group of people that I think are vulnerable to, at risk of being genocided, I think it's the Fulanis. Now, here's the deal. If one attempts to deal with the terrorism problem in West Africa without taking into consideration the whole Fulani aspect of the jihadist insurgencies, I really think that one's efforts are bound to fail. However, in many countries, the tendency is either to ignore this aspect of the jihadist insurgencies or to take it to heart, but to draw the wrong conclusion, being to kill all the Fulanis. The latter is precisely what's going on in much of the region. I mean, just last week, Malian forces went into a town in Mali, in central Mali, and they detained as many as 30 Fulanis and marched them off into some forest and apparently slit their throats. I wish I could say that this was an isolated incident, but it's not. This kind of thing happens far too often. It happens in Mali, it happens in Burkina Faso, it happens in Nigeria, and there's a risk of this pattern replicating itself in other areas where which are now having to deal with this sort of Fulani-dominated jihadist insurgency. I'm thinking in particular about Benin and Togo. And if you want to know really how bad the problem is, in Mali and Burkina Faso, Malian and Burkinabe soldiers have filmed themselves butchering and eating dead jihadists, which are almost certainly Fulani. I've seen the videos. And no, I'm not going to share those videos as part of this video. No, I'm not going to do that. But the point is, it's really bad. Things are really, really bad. My main thesis here, the main thesis of this video is that to understand West Africa's terrorist problem, you have to understand the various dynamics that push Fulanis disproportionately into jihadist armed groups. And solving the terrorist problem requires somehow addressing those dynamics. Killing Fulanis, massacring them is not the answer, and it has been shown only to make matters worse, a lot worse. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, if you're wondering with what authority I feel comfortable talking about Fulanis and West African terrorism, I can tell you this. Literally 20 years ago, I joined the CIA, and almost immediately I was put to work watching terrorism and counterterrorism in West Africa. I've been tracking this topic on and off for the past 20 years. And most recently in my capacity as the Director of Global Programs at 14 North Strategies, which is a business intelligence firm that serves investors in Africa, I've been watching these things very, very closely. So what I'm presenting here in this video is really the distillation of some of my insights from 20 years worth of work. I will, to a large extent, be oversimplifying. I could go into much more detail and get really into the weeds about social things and social hierarchies and that kind of thing and local politics. I'm not going to do that. But the point is, in this case, in this instance, I do know what I'm talking about. I also want to call out, before I get started, a few books that I read on the subject that I think were particularly helpful for me. One is this book. What did I do with it? Here it is. The Jihad Pool. This is fairly recent. Le Jihad Pool au Sahel Central. In French, it's very helpful. There's another book that I found, an older book called Pasteur et Paysan de Gourma, which is in Mali, written by Jean Gallet. Now, I'm going to do this video by dividing into several parts. And I'm going to put timestamps in the description below. So in part one, I'm going to look at, well, who and where are the Fulanis? Part two, why are Fulanis now at the heart of jihadist insurgencies? Part three, what West African nations are doing about the Fulani question? And part four, is there a better way? Part one. Fulanis are a large ethno-linguistic group spread across the continent. And as you can see here from this map here, they go from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea and in particular in the Sahel, although also below the Sahel. The numbers of Fulanis in these countries varies from country to country, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of the overall population. Wikipedia offers the following numbers. These numbers are, I'm not going to call them accurate, but they're good enough to give you a general idea. The largest communities are, of course, in Nigeria, Senegal, Guinea, Cameroon, Mali, Burkina Faso, and then also with respect to the percentage of the population. In Senegal, they're 27.5% of the population. In Guinea, they're 33.4% of the population. I've actually read the numbers are much higher, more like 40 or in the 40s. In Guinea-Bissau, they're 30% of the population. In Mali, they're 13.3% of the population. In Burkina Faso, they're 8.4% of the population. Fulanis are very diverse, but they do tend to share a culture, a history, as well as a language, or perhaps maybe I should say a family of languages, because there are various variants. Sometimes the language is referred to as Fulbe or Pool or Polar or Fulani or what have you. Just sort of, it's all more or less the same thing. My single best source, though, when it comes to understanding Fulani culture and the richness of Fulani culture and Fulani history, are the writings of the magnificent Malian novelist Amadou Ompete Ba, who lived from 1901 to 1991. I strongly recommend reading his books. He wrote them in French, but some of them have been translated. I put links to his stuff in the description. Really good take a look. Ompete Ba's books will take you deep into Malian Fulani society in colonial Mali in the first decades of the 20th century. And Ba, among other things, really set himself up as sort of a spokesperson for a particular form of Islam that he associates with sort of with Fulanis. Like this is sort of the Fulani way. And it's actually very beautiful what he wrote. Ompete Ba, by the way, and this is an aside, I thought about this when I got into kind of a fight with one of my kids' teachers, because I was asking, like, why don't you teach them literature or English literature? And the teacher said, well, we can't really teach these books because they're not really relevant for the lived experience of the students in our school. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. And also part of the beauty of books is that it can take you very far away from where you are and who you are and take you to someplace very, very different and introduce you to a world much larger than yourself. So one of the things that I thought of when talking to the teacher about this is Ompete Ba's work, who just writes about the history and the traditions and daily life of Fulani in colonial Mali. And it's just extraordinary that a book can do that. So go and read. A large portion of Fulanis are herders, and a large portion engage in nomadic herding, right? They move the cattle around from place to place, from pasture to pasture, from water source to water source, and kind of a seasonal thing. But that being said, there are a lot of Fulanis who live in cities. There are a lot of Fulanis who farm. In the cities, you're going to find Fulanis doing all sorts of things. You can probably find Fulanis in every conceivable profession. There are educated Fulanis. There are illiterate Fulanis. You're going to find Fulanis in all the state security services. There are Fulanis in politics. There have been Fulani presidents of several of these countries. They really are very diverse. But the stereotype is that Fulanis are herders. And because they're herders, that means that they often have been in conflict with farmers. So in Africa, there's this constant tension between the farmers and herders because the herders like to move their cattle through to graze through land that the farmers cultivate. Historically, these sorts of problems, this is an age-old problem, but historically, it was always kind of controlled. The conflicts were controlled, and the fighting that resulted from these conflicts were controlled because of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms and all sorts of ways that traditional societies would kind of tamp this down and keep things from getting out of hand. Those mechanisms have eroded for all sorts of reasons. Plus nowadays, because of the proliferation of small arms and things like AK-47s, little fights have become a lot more lethal than they ever have been in the past. Fulani society, I wish to stress, is far from monolithic. It's divided by complex hierarchies. There are Fulani groups and sects or castes, maybe you could say, that are high up in the pecking order and then at the bottom of the pecking order. And you've got elites and sort of commoners, and you've got former slaves and, winners and losers and all sorts of different groups. So it's really very diverse. Now, we need to back up, though, and think about Fulani's role or place in larger society. And I think that the best way to think about it is in terms of a three-way relationship between the Fulanis, non-Fulanis, amongst whom they live or amongst whom they interact, and the state. So in this three-way thing, the state often plays this role of being an arbitrator between the Fulanis and the non-Fulanis. The state also, the African states often, and the colonial administrations before them often have had policies regarding Fulanis and non-Fulanis and managing the relationship with them and managing the sort of conflicts that emerge between the Fulanis and the non-Fulanis. By and large, it has often been the case that Fulanis have perceived themselves to be discriminated against by the state, to get sort of the always the short end of the stick. and that the state will discriminate against them or maybe even sometimes persecute them. So there's sort of like large, long-standing grievances against the state. But that being said, perhaps an even better way of thinking about it is not just this three-way thing about between like the Fulanis, non-Fulanis, and the state, but rather you have, remember I said that Fulanis themselves have all sorts of striations and hierarchies. And what this means is that for a given political dispensation in a local community, sort of a relationship between the Fulanis and the non-Fulanis in the state, you've got some levels of Fulani society or some parts of Fulani society that do well by this political dispensation and like it and support it and are supported by it, right? The state might support certain Fulani elites, or the colonial administrators might have supported certain Fulani elites. But then you have other groups that are less well served by the status quo and less well served by the political dispensation. And also in the conflicts, intra-Fulani conflicts between these different groups, the state thus plays a role in arbitrating these conflicts. But again, then you've got the problem where Fulanis tend to think that the state is corrupt or it discriminates against them, or maybe it favors the elites, the elites buy them off. There's a lot of unhappiness that's sort of associated with this relationship. Although, again, most of the time everybody gets along, most of the time there really aren't any problems. Part 2, Fulanis and jihadist insurgencies. Fulanis are not strangers to jihad. In fact, in the 19th century, before colonization, there were at least 2 major jihadist movements that took place in West Africa that were led by Fulanis and led to the establishment of Fulani empires. At least 2 throughout this entire region that existed before colonization. The colonial powers really put an end to all that and ended up sort of disempowering these Fulani empires and breaking them up, but then also sort of then freezing in place these sort of social hierarchies, relationships between the Fulanis and the non-Fulanis, but then also the hierarchies within the Fulani community. In the 21st century, in the Sahel, the jihadist insurgency that we recognize today, what's going on in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, etc., that actually started in northern Mali amongst Arabs and Tuaregs, and it was an offshoot of the Algerian Civil War. The jihadism there, the jihadist groups, they took root, they recruited locals, primarily Arabs and Tuaregs, but then some Sangrai got into it. But still, it was a northern Malian thing. The Fulani really didn't have much to do with it at all. In 2012, however, in the sort of the tumult of the coup of 2012, and then there was a Tuareg rebellion, and then the coup, and then all sorts of really bad things happened throughout Mali in 2012, 2013. And the result was that there was in midst of all of this, there was a very charismatic Fulani leader who raised the flag of jihad and basically said, okay, now we're going to have like a Fulani jihad. And at that point, the epicenter of the jihadist insurgency in Mali really shifted to central Mali and became much less about Arabs and Tuaregs and much more about the Fulani. The same thing happened in Burkina Faso. What happened was there was a charismatic Burkinabe Fulani leader who was in Mali and he was active in the Malian Fulani jihadist group, who went back to Burkina Faso and he set up shop and he kicked off a jihadist insurgency amongst the Fulani in Burkina Faso. And that's how Burkina Faso he set it on fire, and it's burning very, very hotly today. Fulani are less central to jihad in Niger, but they're involved. They're heavily involved in Nigeria. The risk to Ghana, Togo, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire is by and large associated with Fulanis, both coming in across the border from Burkina Faso, but also local Fulanis. I'm going to add to that while most of the Fulani jihadists that I referred to are associated with this Al-Qaeda affiliated jihadist coalition called JNIM. Also, Islamic State in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso is largely a Fulani phenomenon. So the question then is why? Why are Fulanis disproportionately represented in the jihadist insurgencies that we now see in West Africa? Ideology, religious ideologies does play some role, as does an element of Fulani irredentism. There's some memory that many Fulani have of the great Fulani empires of the 19th century. But I think most of the evidence suggests that what generally drives the Fulani participation in the jihad has to do with local politics, local grievances, intra-Fulani conflict, intra-Fulani grievances, and grievances associated with relations between Fulanis and their neighbors, and also with the state. Now, in this part of the world, it's really important to understand that political authority often goes hand in hand with religious authority. You have this elite, you have a structure, you have a given political dispensation with certain elites, certain people in charge, and certain people are subordinate. And this is often underpinned by a religious thing. You've got these traditional religious leaders who lend their credibility and the legitimacy to supporting and propping up the system. So what this means is that in order to challenge the elites politically, you often do this by challenging them religiously, or vice versa, because it's all sort of the same thing. Let's go back to Attentivement. Attentivement, in his books, espoused a traditional form of Islam that was associated with, that he identified with traditional Fulani religious leaders. And theirs was an Islam that was influenced by Sufism, I think by the Sufi brotherhoods, and by more than a little traditional African spirituality and spiritualism and animism and that sort of thing. And it all becomes a really good target for anybody who, for whatever reason, thinks that this is this weird hybrid. This is not a pure form of Islam. And a way to rebel against this, and also a way to rebel both against the traditional Islam and the traditional political system, is by, well, you do one or the other, but you rebel against the traditional political order by challenging the religious order, by challenging the religious authorities, and doing so in the name of some sort of purified form of Islam. And this happens all the time in West Africa. This is very common. In most West African countries, you have these Islamic reformist movements or Islamist movements that play a real role. They're really critical of the status quo, and they're really critical of the way religion is often practiced. Most, I believe, of these groups are benign. They're what you call quietist, which means that they're interested in changing religious practice and having a spiritual influence, but they're not interested in armed rebellion or terrorism or anything like that. However, some are, and some are into jihadism. And then what happened in Mali and in Burkina Faso is that a few decided that violent jihadism was the way to go, and they raised the flag of jihad, and they managed to attract followers. There are also economic motives here. At stake is access to resources like pasture and water. You've got like certain Fulani elites control the water, and if you want to bring your cattle to get the water, you've got to pay them tolls, or you want to access a certain pasture. It's like you're controlling the resources. There's the disadvantaged in this system feel like they're put upon by the elites, backed by the state, backed by the traditional religious authorities, and they want to rebel against all of these things. And also, recent examples of armed rebellion in this area have shown that it pays. If you're a young man looking for an opportunity to advance socially and economically, you don't have many options in this part of the world. What you can do is you can become a rebel or a jihadist, and it pays. It's a weird way of putting it, but it's a way to get money. It's a way to get social status. It's a way to advance politically, socially, and economically. And remember, there are very few opportunities here of any sort, economic opportunities. All of this, of course, is happening in the context of soaring populations. The population growth rate in this part of the world is just staggering, the highest, I think, anywhere in the world. And also, so you've got more and more people who are competing for fewer resources. And you also have climate change. And climate change really is a big deal because, for one thing, it means that there's like less water and less pasture. But it also means that where the water is and where the pasture is shifts. So that if you're a nomadic herder, you've got to take your cattle to different places, which causes more conflict and new friction. And often what happens is that the migratory routes go further south, right? So deeper into the cultivated areas. And it just heightens the friction between the different groups who are competing for the different resources. Some Fulanis join the jihadist groups for religious ideological reasons. Some join because of local grievances. Some seek some sort of economic advantage. Also, unfortunately, a lot of them just seek protection. Because as soon as some of these Fulanis raised the flag of jihad, what happened was the state security services and their allies, like various paramilitaries and local communal militias, went after them. And they went after them collectively by attacking and massacring Fulani communities. So simply protection, it becomes a profound or very important driver of recruitment of a lot of Fulani into the jihadist movement. We must always remember, however, that we're talking about a small percentage of the Fulani population, And I strongly believe that the vast majority of Fulanis in any of these countries wants nothing to do with violence or jihadism. That's not what they're interested in at all. And the evidence that I have for this is that if you point to two of the countries that have the largest Fulani populations by percentage of the population, I'm thinking Guinea and Senegal, you see that they don't have jihad. There's no jihadist violence. It's not a problem. These countries have problems, but not that problem. One reason might be because the Fulani populations there are so large that they've got power and influence and clout. And maybe they also just feel safer. They feel more empowered, and they don't feel as put upon or as persecuted as they do as those who are parts of much smaller communities as a proportion of the overall population. That's just a theory. Likewise, it's also important to add that Fulanis are among the chief victims of jihadist violence, and they're also overly represented amongst the refugee population, the IDP population, people who are fleeing the violence. So, for instance, if you go to the refugee camps that are on the Mauritanian side of Mauritania's border with Mali, those camps are full of Malian Fulanis who have fled the violence. And fled it because they're really caught between two fires. On one hand, you've got the jihadists who are attacking them, and on the other hand, you've got the state security services and their militias, and Wagner who are attacking them. So it's an extremely difficult situation for most Fulanis. Most Fulanis are victims. Some Fulanis are perpetrators. Part 3, what do African countries do about this Fulani question? I see two basic responses. One is to ignore the Fulani aspect of the problem altogether, and therefore ignore or pay no attention to the different factors and dynamics that are driving Fulani recruitment into the jihadist movements. One variant of this that I've heard from some African officials is sort of a form of denial, where they say it's those Fulanis, the foreign Fulani that come into our country are the problem. It's not our own Fulani. I think either way, you're talking about denial, and it's an opportunity, it's an excuse not to look carefully at what's going on in the Fulani communities, to try to understand the dynamics at play in the Fulani communities, and try to think about, well, why do so many of them join the jihadist groups, and what can we possibly do about it other than simply massacring them? The other common response is in fact massacre, violence against Fulanis, but taken as collective targets. This is the norm in Central African Republic, in Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Niger to some extent, possibly Cameroon. Fulanis, as I said, therefore find themselves caught between two fires. On one hand, they suffer from violence perpetrated by the jihadist groups. On the other hand, they suffer from violence perpetrated by the state security services. It's not just the state security services, it's also militias, like in Burkina Faso. They have this militia called the VDP, which commits a lot of atrocities against Fulanis. And then you also have these local community militias that basically use this whole conflict as a way to, I don't know, even the score against the Fulanis. I'm not sure what. Groups like in Mali, you've got Dozo hunters who are often involved in Malian military actions against Fulanis, and also they were involved in some of the Russian mercenary activities against Fulanis. Part 4, is there a better way? There clearly is, but that requires looking objectively at the many dynamics at play that drive Fulani participation in jihadist movements. This involves looking at things like resource management and conflict resolution mechanisms, involves improving these things or establishing them where they don't even exist. So basically governance, that's really it. It's about governance. And ideally there needs to be development, anything that increases the economic opportunities for people in these rural communities. But it also involves something that's all too rare, which is you have to have a political will to think about these things and address them. And you also have to have governments that are trusted by all sides to, in good faith, work to figure out equitable arrangements that serve all the communities, managing the farmer-herder problem, managing the resource management problem, managing all these sorts of issues. A good faith, objective, non-corrupt state would go a long way. Is this possible? I'd like to think so. Challenging? Absolutely. Now, the Gulf of Guinea states, and by that I mean Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Togo, which are really terrified about the spread of jihadism, Fulani jihadism from Burkina Faso, to their great credit, are doing a lot of the right things. So what they've done is they've sort of declared these zones in the northern parts of their countries, which are the most vulnerable, and they're working on the governance piece and they're working on the development piece, along with security stuff. Are they doing enough? Probably not, but at least they're, their head's kind of in the right place, and I think that's really to be encouraged. And thus far, there's little evidence of them falling into the trap of just collectively targeting Fulanis. There've been no massacres or anything like that, which is wonderful. I really hope it stays that way. I think for me, the bottom line is that combat operations against jihadist groups is necessary, but it'll never be sufficient until the local drivers and local dynamics are addressed. They're thought about, considered, and there's some attempt, good faith attempt, to actually deal with them while also doing the security stuff. That requires, above all, and I think the most important thing that requires is simply the political will to do that. Unfortunately, the will often seems to be lacking, and these governments often prefer to take shortcuts, and the shortcuts that they prefer are usually military shortcuts. Let's get Wagner to kill them. Let's buy new weapons. Let's buy Turkish drones. That's cheaper and easier. These are like silver bullets, but it's not doing the hard work, the political work of reforging the social contract with Fulani communities and with the neighbors, the communities that interact with the Fulanis. I also wonder if there's a way to help state security services be more discerning with respect to being able to distinguish between the bad actors and the not bad actors. And the example that I have that directly comes to mind is the Mora massacre in Mali in 2022. Maybe like 300 people were killed. I believe most, if not all, were Fulanis. And I talked to a Malian officer about this, and he had some really interesting things to say about the Mora massacre. And one of the things he said was that like this was a legitimate military operation because the JNIM, the terrorist group, uses that market and other markets in order to buy supplies, to get funds by taxing people, selling cattle. Like it's a really important thing in terms of logistics for the jihadist groups. So Mali has a strategy of shutting down the jihadist group's ability to do that using these community markets. So apparently they had good intel that JNIM was present in Mora, and they rolled in and they cast a very wide net and they detained a whole lot of people, and they killed a large number of them. So I asked the Malian officer, well, okay, did you have processes in place to try to sift out the bad guys and thus to spare the good people or the innocents or the neutrals or whatever? And he said that it would be good if they could do that, but they lack the capability, they lack the capacity. So rather than attacking the problem with like a paring knife, they go at it with an axe. And as a result, a lot of people get caught up in this and a lot of people get killed. So the question therefore becomes, like, maybe it's possible to work with these groups in order to, or with the state security services in order to try to enable them to be more discerning. The catch, of course, is whether or not they even have the will to do this. And I'm not entirely sure that they do. And I think certainly in Mali, I think it's the case that they kind of like this, the Malian security services. So for instance, when one of the things that I heard from Malians, when the French were still in Mali, and there's already talk about inviting Russians in, and people were saying that they would rather have Russians as security partners than the French. And I asked why, because to me, like, you don't want Russians doing this because Russian counterinsurgency just generally involves just killing everybody. And the line that I was given was that, well, the Russians would take off the gloves, enlever les gants. And so there's this notion that you need to be violent, you need to kill a lot of people. And this is just how it's done. And which is something the French would certainly never abide by. The French would not have anything to do with this. And the French and all the other Westerners who had been involved in training Malian forces, I'm thinking about the European Training Mission in Mali, EUTM, I know for a fact that they worked hard with the Malian military in order to try to improve their human rights record. And apparently their human rights record actually did improve. They were listening. And so even, I think Human Rights Watch even said, at least one report saying, yeah, their record's gotten better, they're behaving better, which suggests that maybe some of this training was rubbing off. But then, of course, they kick the French out, they bring the Russians in, and all that's just out the window. And the fact that you've got these videos of Malian soldiers cutting up and eating parts of dead jihadis tells me that there's something rotten in terms of the institutional culture, because this is being, I don't think it's being encouraged by the command structure, but it's tolerated, and there's this sort of attitude or approach towards fighting locals, fighting jihadists, which in their minds is almost always Fulanis, that kind of encourages that sort of thing. So it's a question about sort of culture, but also political will. It takes a lot of will to reform a military. It takes a lot of will to get your military to behave differently. It takes a lot of will to change your tactics and to change your doctrine, that sort of thing. And if that will does not exist, then there's really no way that you can try to lead them or encourage them. Like you could lead a horse to water, but if they don't want to drink this, then it's whatever. It's not going to work. I should add that one of the more depressing aspects of West African society that I've encountered is the racism that you hear from different groups about other groups. So different ethnic groups who belong to different tribes, ethnicities, or races, whatever, will just tell you terrible things about the others, and there's often almost like a willing ignorance. So I hear a lot of anti-Fulani rhetoric. The worst, I think, are from Southern Nigerians. Like, I follow Nigerians on Twitter, and like Southern Nigerians just say some of the most horrific things. And you really want to get a sense of sort of racism against Fulanis. I hate to say this, but like, talk to Southern Christian Nigerians, and they will tell you some things that will be disturbing. Okay, so I hope I've taught you something about what's going on in West Africa, and why Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Nigeria are home to so many horrors, why Mali, I think, is falling apart, why Burkina Faso is basically like a dead man walking. If you hear about terrorist attacks in these countries, there's a really good chance that Fulanis are involved. And if you hear about violence by state security services against, or paramilitaries or their other allies, against civilians, there's a very good chance that the victims are Fulanis. Perhaps I'm predisposed to liking Fulanis because I read a ton of Ampate Ba, and I was just kind of enamored with the world that he created. But I strongly believe that both the Fulani involvement in jihadist insurgencies and their victimization at the hands of these states, in the name of counterterrorism, are entirely avoidable. None of this is necessary. None of this is unavoidable. If you like this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and consider sending thanks my way, or perhaps signing up for a membership. The more you support me, the more I can keep doing these videos. There's a link in the description there's a thing, buy me a coffee. You can put some money in there. There's also the thanks button that YouTube offers, and then you can do memberships either through the YouTube or through the buy me a coffee. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye bye.